In the 2019 provincial budget, the Ford government cut funding to Legal Aid Ontario by 30%, or the equivalent of $133 million. It's prompted quite an outcry from members of the legal community. Here to explain why, Avvy Go. She is director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, and Patricia Hughes, former executive director of the Law Commission of Ontario, now a contributor to Slaw. That's Canada's online legal magazine. Avvy, good to see you again, and I think you for the first time here.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, delighted to have you here. Patricia, just help us understand a bit of the background here. Who uses legal aid?
Well, people who are sufficiently poor to pass the eligibility requirements. So if you're an individual, for example, you need to earn just around $17,000 to be eligible for legal aid, except for domestic violence cases, which are a little higher. So the reality is that the levels are not very high, and it means a lot of people are excluded.
And Avvy, what kinds of cases would be involved?
Well, legal aid has many different types of services. So on the certificate side, where you apply for legal aid to get a counsel through the private bar, usually they cover criminal and family law matters. Legal aid also has duty counsel in the court system to help people just deal with the matters that appeared in court that particular day. And then they have the legal clinics, which we are part of. For legal clinics, we cover a whole host of areas of law, including housing, social assistance, people who are denied employment insurance. In our case, for instance, at our clinic, we help a lot of low-income workers who are victims of wage theft. And we also help many victims of violence, and so on and so forth. So there's like a wide range of services covered.
And let me now get a sense from both of you about what a $130 million plus cut will do to all of that. Patricia.
Well, obviously, it's going to make it more difficult to offer the services that are offered now, which are really not sufficient. One of the real problems that's come up, of course, is that the Ontario government has made it clear that no provincial funding can be used for immigration and refugee cases, and that somehow the federal government will have to make sure that sufficient funding's there, or in fact, they won't get help. So that is a serious problem, but obviously others as well. And that remains to be seen. It's also clear that there are expectations that the government will give further instructions and direction on what they have called the justice system. So it's not clear whether or not they'll be more specific about the changes that need to be made at legal aid and elsewhere.
Avvy, what do you see as the implications?
Well, we don't know yet from the legal clinic point of view what it means to us, but certainly a cut of this magnitude for sure will directly impact on clinics and the services we provide to low-income and moderate-income families. So I'm very concerned. For instance, just take our clinic as an example. We have 7 funded positions with 3 lawyers, including myself, 2 community workers, 3 community workers and an office manager who also double duty as a receptionist. So we are what we call frontline work. And in fact, the government has made it very clear that when they cut legal aid, it should not affect frontline work. But all of our clients, all of our self-serve clients, but if legal aid has projected deficit now of $53 million, they have to find cuts somewhere. And I won't be surprised if they're going to come to clinic and say that, well, sorry, you have to lay off staff, right? As soon as they do that, it's going to affect a lot of clinics and a lot of our clients. Particularly, we serve clients that are very vulnerable. There's a higher percentage of racialized people served by clinics because people of color, Indigenous people are more likely to live in poverty. We have a very high percentage of women, including domestic violence victims, a lot of clients with mental health challenges. All of these clients are people that private bar don't usually like to serve because they're very difficult to serve and they face multiple barriers to access to justice. So these people have been relying on clinics and on legal aid to get access to the court system and the tribunal. So I really have fear that I'm not sure where they are going to turn if we start cutting services.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because if you can't access a lawyer that way. You're not going to go to Bay Street and hire a
That's
lawyer.
right.
So what are you going to do?
That's right.
What
Well,
will they do?
you end up in a self-represented litigant situation, and we'll use litigant in a very loose way here. I mean, it may or may not be a court case, but it's somebody who's trying to vindicate their rights. And the difficulties for self-represented litigants or people trying to vindicate their rights is that it is hard to know how to use the legal system. There are all kinds of different ways in which people have made efforts to do that, whether or not it's judges who are supposed to help self-represented litigants in the courtroom, whether it's coaching them, unbundled services where they might be able to get some assistance with part of their case, and so on. And there's quite a lot there. But many people will end up not trying to assert their rights at all because it's too difficult. Or they will end up, and one thing we do know is that self-represented litigants do not do as well as people who are represented. There is something that I think is really important to appreciate, and that is that the justice system, the legal system, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not there on an island. There's all kinds of other aspects of our system that are linked with the legal system. So people who can't go to court to vindicate their rights and perhaps aren't able to address an employment problem, as an example, may end up losing their home. They may end up with family difficulties. They may end up with mental stress or physical health difficulties. They may commit crimes. So when we look at cutting the access issue, cutting people's access to the legal system, we have to remember that it's going to have an effect elsewhere in the system and in the services that are provided. And I'm not sure that that's something that's really looked at adequately.
If the number of lawyers at your clinic ends up being cut in half, let's say, presumably that means your clients will still have access to justice and to legal advice, but they may have to wait twice as long for it. Is that possible?
It's possible, but also I think we will just not be able to serve as many clients. So again, take our clinic as an example. We received additional funding over the last couple of years as a result of new investment in legal aid. So with that new funding, what we did was expand the mandate of our clinic from the Greater Toronto area to all of Ontario. So we started serving clients from Ottawa, Windsor, London, Kitchener-Waterloo.
Where'd you get the extra money from?
From Legal Aid Ontario.
Okay.
So they got the money from the government, right? So, and we actually dropped the name, like we used to be called Metro Toronto. And we dropped that name because we have expanded our service province-wide, and we increased a number of clients that we serve, within the last year and a half. We've just been a year and a half that we did that. Hundreds of clients more who are living outside GTA. If we have to go back to the previous number of staff, we may simply just not serve clients from outside GTA because we cannot do it. We just don't have the resources to do it. So the clients who are now accessing our services, I don't know where they went before. And I think, as Patricia said, that they may end up, just represent themselves in the tribunal. Or, a lot of our clients, they come to us because they have language barriers. And a lot of the tribunals do not provide interpretation services. All the forms are in French and English. So a lot of people may simply just give up, and not pursue.
Let me put an uncomfortable truth to both of you, and I want to get your reaction to it. For the clients that you represent who are dealing with immigration cases or refugee cases, those are both federal policies. Those are both policies imposed on the province by the Government of Ontario. The Government of Ontario, rightly or wrongly, has made a decision that they're not about to pick up the tab for decisions that they have no input into. And their view is, why should they? Can you speak to whether you think they're on solid legal, ethical, moral, etc. grounds taking that position?
The province?
Yeah.
I just want to make it clear, just for people that I'm not involved in representing clients at all. That's not that's Avvy's excitement and contribution. Are they on solid ground? Well, I think you have to look at the fact that many aspects of what immigrants and refugees need are actually within the province's purview. So housing, for example, social benefits, for example. You could go through a list of different issues that are provincial.
That's all true, but the numbers of immigrants and the numbers of refugees and the complicated nature of, or not, of their cases would all have been stuff outside the provincial purview and imposed on them by the feds.
Can I respond to that? And I think, first of all, I think a lot of people don't realize criminal code is also a federal legislation, but the Ontario government is paying for because we have constitutional right, protected rights to access to legal services in criminal matters. There are many other legislations that are federal. So EI, like employment insurance, CPPD, OAS. Like all of these are income maintenance issues that many clients of legal clinics are coming to clinic for help with.
Okay, but when an unemployed person applies for employment insurance,
it's a federal legislation.
right, and it doesn't cost the province anything.
For the employment insurance.
Right.
Right.
But this does.
Well, criminal
That's the
code
province's point.
and criminal justice cost the province a lot of money, right? Because we have correctional system that the province pay for, right? So it's not just about the money, but also I think that maybe a lot of people don't realize that even Canadians have immigration issue. It's not just the refugees, right? So for instance, if you're a Canadian citizen, you want to sponsor your parents, your spouse, your children from overseas.
I get this, Avvy, but the point I'm not making the point. I am giving voice to the provincial government's view, which is if the federal government, imposes the immigration levels or accepts X number of refugees, then they should pay, given that it's their policy, the Fed should pay for whatever the costs are associated with that, not the province. And that's why the province feels it's on solid ground, cutting the legal aid budget. I'm just saying that's their position.
I think you also have to think about it in a broader way, the same way we have to think about access to justice in a broader way. And that is when new people come into the province, they're contributing to the province as well. And so they do get employment. They pay taxes, whether it's federally or provincially. They make other kinds of contributions. And I think this business, to some extent, and I appreciate, really, my background is constitutional law, I appreciate arguments that are based on the Constitution. I mean, they're exciting to think about, and they have very practical ramifications. But at the same time, these are questions that affect us as a country. And then we have a responsibility, provincially and federally, to appreciate that we have to deal with some matters together. And in the past, the provinces did appreciate that. So Ontario had agreed to a system in which there was some shared responsibility on these issues.
As far back, Patricia, as far back as I can remember, people who do what you do have complained to the provincial government that they have, doesn't matter what party was in power, legal aid was never adequately resourced.
Well, it's not. It's not.
So this is not a new phenomenon.
No, but it's the biggest cut that legal aid has had.
Yes.
So there is a difference. And I do think we need to find out, or will find out later, in the auditor's report, or in the report, sorry, not the auditor's report, but a different report. Yeah, it might have been the auditor's report. That's right. There was a statement about looking at legal aid and how it's delivered and comparing it to other provinces and whether or not there should be changes there. So that shoe still has to drop. We don't know what that will be. So,
but I do agree that the federal government can contribute a lot more than what they do now in terms of the refugee funding for refugee cases. So I think, and even like I've appeared before the Justice Committee at the federal level to talk about this issue, and they had a report that was done 2 years ago recommending, looking at the funding for legal aid. And certainly I think that the province has some legitimate complaint to make because a very large percentage of the refugees and immigrants do come to Ontario. So, and the federal government funding for legal aid hasn't really increased that much.
So if the federal government were to make a contribution concomitant with the size of the problem that, if you like, they have helped create by having the policies that they have had on refugees, what do you think would be a satisfactory number for the feds to transfer to the province to take care of this?
I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Tens
to
of
the
millions
question.
of dollars, though, presumably, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
We're talking that magnitude of money.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, I
No,
cut you off. What
I
did
was
you wanna
just going to say, I don't think there's any question that any, people who are committed to this kind of work believe and, or to the social ramifications of this, believe that the Fed should also be paying more money. But there are two issues. I mean, one is the amount of money and where it comes from. And the other is, how do we see the notion of building a society? And depending on, depending on how you look at that, then you either can argue, well, it's a federal problem, so just pay it. Or you can say, this is something that others have to be involved in as well.
Well, okay, I mean, you've opened the door to have me, again, put what the Finance Minister of Ontario's position on this would be, which is, look, he hasn't said it in these exact words, but I think he'd say something like, I'm asking the healthcare system to tighten its belt. I'm asking the education system to tighten its belt. I'm asking the Ministry of the Environment to tighten its belt. Indigenous Affairs to tighten its belt. How can I not ask Legal Aid Ontario to tighten its belt as well? Because they're trying to reduce the deficit and balance the budget 5 years down the road.
Right. I think there are three responses to that. First of all, 30% cut is not just about tightening its belt.
That's bigger.
It's like a huge, drastic decrease. But also, I think that, and there are studies, including a study in the U.S., that shows that every dollar invested in legal aid or legal services will result in $5 returned to the government because we prevent homelessness from happening. We make sure people have food on the table. So those are issues that I think the government should also consider.
So you'd spend less money on healthcare, less money on prisons, less money on all those other things.
Yeah, and I can give you a very concrete example of the investment that result from having legal aid services. We, several years ago, we represent a group of garment factory workers who were laid off, didn't get any workers' wages, termination pay. We helped them get hundreds of thousands of dollars back, and they used the money to invest and actually bought a restaurant. They are now running one of the most popular restaurants in Toronto.
Do you want to name it?
I don't want to name it, but
Okay.
it has the best sticky rice chicken in Toronto.
How can you tempt us with the best sticky rice chicken in Toronto and not tell us the name of the place?
But it's an example, and I gave that example to the minister when I met with her a month ago. Because
Which minister was this?
Caroline Maroney.
Oh, okay, the
we
Attorney General.
Yeah, the Attorney General. And it really shows that because the client may not have made that claim against the employer
Without
if they
help.
didn't have us, right? If they didn't have legal aid. And even if they decide to make a claim, their claim may not have been successful if they didn't know how to navigate the system. So there is real concrete benefits to our society by ensuring people have access to justice.
Do you think you can get the province of Ontario to revisit the size of this cut?
Personally?
No, I mean, you're in the you're in the business. I mean, you're coming on this television program presumably to
Right.
to get the message out and indirectly lobby. So, do you think you can get them to revisit it?
They don't seem particularly open to it.
Have you asked?
It's hard, not personally. I mean, that's not what I do. But I think legal aid itself needs to address this as well, and they are trying to address it. They can be very specific about the impact once they've figured it out. It's not clear yet. I think one of the difficulties right now is not knowing exactly what the effects are going to be. What we've said and what Avvy has indicated in a very concrete way for her own clinic as well as others is one thing, but without knowing exactly what the government's expecting here, I think it's difficult. But
Avvy, in our last minute here, can you tell me whether you think you can get them to revisit this?
I certainly hope they will, and I think that, as I mentioned, I met with Minister Mulroney, and I think she certainly genuinely care about the services we provide. We talked about the nail salon workers that we are helping, and she was really interested in the work that we do. And I don't think that they actually have thought it through in terms of the impact of the cuts on the direct services. So I think that now that with more information coming out, and I certainly hope that they will reconsider this decision.
we can say that the government has changed its mind about some other things.
Well, autism,
Right.
for example.
They have,
Autism
when
policy.
people have indicated what the result might be and have lobbied for it, they have changed their mind.
Yeah.
And so certainly from that point of view, there's a possibility that they might do that.
Good enough. That is Avvy Go. She is with the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, and Patricia Hughes, the founding executive director of the Law Commission of Ontario, retired, and the former dean of law at the University of Calgary. It's great to have both of you on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.